Okay, thank you for that. And I'd like to call the panelists for the first session to the chairs at the front of the stage. This is Setting the Scene, Artist Mobility in an Age of Instability. This conversation is going to be facilitated by Arts Info Point UK. We are roughly on time, and just to let you know that the first break will be after this session at 11:30. And also for those people not in the room, we are trying to, we will have a Q&A at the end of this session, but the people outside the room will also be able to contribute via Zoom. Any questions they have, we'll try and get those involved at the end of this session. So think about questions, and we'll be trying to monitor those as the session unfolds. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to start with Yohann, and then the panelists, if you can all introduce yourselves, that would be great. Does that make sense?
Okay, so my name is Yohann Floch. I'm representing On the Move, just for participants with visual impairments in the room or online. I'm a white man with short brown hair, graying hair, facial hair. My pronouns are he, him. I represent On the Move, which is a European network dedicated to artistic and cultural mobility. We are an information provider, and we document, circulate all sorts of information about international mobility, cross-border mobility, and our artists and all the cultural professionals can be supported, including financially, to access opportunities internationally. In our network, we lead a lot of research projects and information projects, but we are quite famous among the artistic community for signposting on our website a lot of open calls for participation. So usually artists are, very happy to meet us online, to check our website. Almost every day we publish open calls. And we also provide funding guides, so helping artists, but also arts organization and residency centers to fundraise and find financial means to be able to welcome artists from all over the world. In this opening conversation, I guess the idea is to set up and throw some questions that will be later on during the day and during the conference discussed in more depth. Obviously in French, my English is not perfect, and I trust you will wave at me or ask questions or interrupt me if you don't understand me. Maybe we leave it here and have a small round.
Hi, my name is Miha Brebenel. Thank you for that prompt, for the purpose of visually, for facilitating those audience who are visually impaired. I'm a white trans masculine person, and I'm here as one of the co-organizers of MASSIA, which is an open residency and project space set in Estonia, together with Sepideh, who will introduce themselves in a second. We will be talking about this space and about the challenges of self-organizing, self-running, and just using our resources and our energy collectively to do all the keeping of a residency space, both in terms of material maintaining a building, the administrative and care labor that is involved in this, the organizing labor, and the kind of on-site requirements of the space, as well as trying to find ways to open up access to different publics, considering that this is an unfunded residency format. I'll pass on to Seb.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sepideh, or Sepi in short, if you cannot remember. For the visually impaired, I'm a light-skinned person of color. I'm wearing some bold colors, and I'm wearing a kepi. I think Miha already said why I am here. We're co-organizing the space, MASSIA. Yeah, I'm looking forward to conversing with you.
Thank you. My name is Manojna. I think very much following suit from Sepi's suggestion. If Manojna feels like a mouthful, please feel free to call me Manu or Mano. I've also been known to respond to Magnolia, but maybe let's not push our luck today. My pronouns are she and hers. I am based out of India, although today I'm really speaking on behalf of the project that I work with, which is Artists at Risk Connection, a program from PEN America. I think maybe there are definitely those of you who we've had long-term relationships with. If not, then I'm looking forward to making those new connections in the next couple of days. Our program is headquartered in New York, but very much as I mentioned right now, we do have a global remit. We have colleagues who work out of Latin America, Africa, etc. as well. And my work primarily juggles itself between Asia at large. So that's East, Southeast, South Asia, and increasingly Central Asia. And of course, you know, really stepping into a lot more of the global work as well. So just mentioning this to make sure that to a large extent, I think a lot of my conversation will really be drawing on my experiences working with relocation programs and residencies based out of Asia in particular, and of course, the Asian diaspora.
Just to say, you will notice that there is a missing panelist here, that is Ukhona. Unfortunately, she couldn't travel. She has a bit of a family emergency at home, but we have got a short film presentation, which I'd like to play now. If I can operate this with my usual slickness.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ukhona Ntsali Mlandu. I very much would have loved to join you in person, but life had other plans. I'm going to attempt to do this in 10 minutes. So I worked for a residency, Greatmore Studios. I run a residency myself. I'm an artist, and my lived experience and understanding of the residency space is that one of the key elements of it is the ability to move through space, something that is commonly known as cultural mobility. And so my work in the various spheres of this value chain have led me to kind of want to contribute to the conversation around cultural mobility. And from an African perspective, what I understand to be, you know, some of the ways in which the visa system present as technical limitations to cultural mobility that inhibit and harm Africans. So the visa application system, I'm proposing that it's a form of weathering, and I'm going to explain to you what a weathering is. It's instrumentalized as a tool to mete out structural violence against marginalized groups. Structural violence describes the ways in which social structures are designed to stop certain individuals and groups from reaching their full potential. Violence here does not solely refer to physical violence, but to the avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs or the impairment of human life, which lowers the actual degree to which someone is able to meet their needs below that which would otherwise be possible. This is a quote from We Carry Generational Demands for Healing That Will Not Rest, an African feminist exploration of healing justice as an analytical lens and a practice from Urgent Action Fund. So what is weathering? Weathering, Alain Geronomius coined weathering as a public health concept to underscore how we use how we embody stressors and oppressors in the broader environment, and how this process causes preventable illness, premature death. While the scientific establishment prefers to focus on genetic rather than socio-political explanations for racial health disparity, and I add quality of life disparities, and as alluded in the structural violence description above, the ways in which one is able to fully self-actualize. Proponents of weathering and other kindred concepts are fighting to get us to consider the structural determinants of health, the institutions, the processes that cause health disparities. So naming the harm, in quoting Ruha Benjamin in her book called Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want, she states that in the United Kingdom, they call it what it is. Former Prime Minister Theresa May's hostile environment policy was rolled out in 2012 as a set of legal requirements and administrative practices designed to make living in Britain for a subset of immigrants as burdensome as possible, so they voluntarily leave. But even in places without an explicit policy, hostile environments are made and remade daily through the mechanizations of institutional and individual alike. So, end quote. This is not to say that immigration or immigrants are synonymous with cultural mobility, although there are obviously intersections. However, the same principles and tactics described here apply to cultural mobility in its expansive and dynamic definition. They form a significant part of why the assertion that the visa application system is a form of weathering holds water, because it is administered via the same bureaucratic systems at national, regional, and international levels. Its process employs the same logic of determining legitimacy, eligibility, and compliance. It is based on a set of implicit biases that are Euro and the political global North-centric, pertaining to policing movement. With the world demographics being what they are, where the African continent is made of what is known as the Black African majority, applying a critical race theory to examining mobility politics when offering an African perspective is not far-fetched, and neither is it to disregard the presence of white people who move through the world with African passports. It's rather take on an pan-African view of what is meant by an African perspective, and to know that the global majority demographic is that of Black people, but as a people, Black people happen to sit at the bottom of the ladder in terms of the hierarchy of being afforded liberties. Black people experience racism. Racism is one of the tools used to inflict a set of intersecting discriminations, of which mobility, and more specifically for this purpose, cultural mobility is one. This compounds on existing traumas. If you cannot fathom what that is, you're very fortunate and privileged, and your inability to do so speaks to your kinds of protections that your particular identities and positionality affords you. And so also beyond this kind of thinking, the concept of weathering is battling its own version of anti-Black climate denial, because the society that just refuses to see the intersecting struggles and is very good at individualizing and individualizing responsibility, when in most cases it's a collective and a social justice issue. So also beyond the physical violence, there's the spirit murder, which is a term invoked by law professor Patricia J. Williams to remind us that racism has never simply enacted just physical harm, but also continuously robs people of dignity and self-worth, wounding us emotionally, physically. Racism is injurious not only in the immediate moment, but also in the aftermath, when people are forced to prove that they did not distort the circumstances, misunderstand the intent, or even enjoy it. Also, if we are trying to build an alternative world, alternative world building requires us to view this matter from the perspective of the most vulnerable to discrimination in our society, so that we can have a full picture of the extent of the harm in order to be able to imagine possibilities that center equity and justice. And the Black African experience is a particular experience that carries multiple vulnerabilities in this context. These can be compounded by possessing gender and identity that is marginalized, such as being woman, genderqueer, disabled, economically disadvantaged to compound on intersecting struggles. And also to understand that whiteness never carries the same degrees of stress of vigilance in these situations ever, because of what white lived experience means in the global politics of vigilance. And I'm going to share with you quickly some of the things that came up in an online conversation panel hosted by the Heinrich Stiftung Foundation on the 19th of June, titled Transcontinental Mobility, How Much Encounter Does Decolonization Mean? I'm not going to mention all the people who were on the panel because I'm going to do a summary and I'm worried about time. So some of the things that came up, and these are things that we've discussed, time that it takes to engage in the process of visa application is burdensome. The physical labor, and I'd like to add the emotional labor that goes hand in hand with anxiety due to uncertainty, performing yourself, passport control anxiety, vigilance, financial aspects of the process, the dehumanization, the invasive and discriminatory nature of the demand for financial declaration as a benchmark for eligibility, what it means to expect one to demonstrate family binds and reason for return. And I'd like to add the ways in which that departs from a trust deficit that is based on an inhospitable and paranoid view of the visage, which is different from what African hospitality uses as its assumption. The fees are fees and costs associated with the full process, including the need to travel to a different locality for interviews, etc., and the policy that denies reimbursements, the extractive elements associated with the visa cost, and the lack of accountability about where the visa costs go. I'd like to add the normalization of this without the call to question the morality and the ethics of this practice. I would also like to add the double standard of knowing this and taking part in this as if it's unchangeable and God ordained, with the immunity to the judgment and conclusion of corruption that is so easily meted out on Africans. You know, the unquestioned moral high ground and purity of Europe, the UK, and the global north, the need to call for more audits into where these funds end up, quantifying the amounts and where they end up, the expected lead time for application and processing that does not take into consideration other travel obligations, suspected and undesirable inconvenient versus welcome visitor stance, conscious and unconscious bias through bias criteria, and a series of unspoken, and I would like to add structurally exclusive, using my timer, using institutionalized violence, polarization, paranoia, and also whose globalization is it? Who does it center? And so the visa policy is not naive, and neither does it happen in isolations of other forms of discrimination. And so I would like to kind of just maybe introduce like this concept of like African hospitality, a distinct texture of hosting and welcoming guests from a perspective that recognizes their presence and choice to grace your home, space, country, territory as an honor and not a burden. This honor is met with warmth, generosity, and good faith that the visitor has come in peace. It is the default position to assume everyone to be of integrity and good intention until proven otherwise. You know, the generosity is extended from a belief system that life and resources are regenerative, and this regenerative logic is beyond logic. It is of a spiritual nature. It is the polar opposite of a scarcity mindset, which breeds self-preservationist behavior based on paranoia. It is rooted in an ethic of collective care. So the discussion about material conditions and the distribution of resources is also part of the political dimension of care and protection. And for me, I quote this from Viral Justice again, for me, applying the word political about care and protection means two things. One, it means that publicness, it means that we can't be silent about tiredness, we can't be silent about conflict and tension. The other thing is resources, whatever types of resources, whether it's personal skills, money, investment, whatever it may be, the politics of care and protection involves strategic publicness and a better public relationship and conversation, as well as a more deliberate, scaled-up allocation of resources. And I think I've run out of time, but as an example, it's making sure that if you're hosting or inviting an African artists for a residency or a cultural worker. You set up systems for better supporting this process with resources such as recognizes that there are expenses that are attached to traveling to embassies for visa appointments. There are childcare implications for those who are mothering or primary care giving in the most gender inclusive and expansive sense of the word. Also, to understand the emotional dimension of this process and support that too, asking the questions and eventually having a checklist that is dynamic and flexible, and to be responsive to the needs of the moment, making accommodations that demonstrate solidarity are necessary for repairing and imagining collaborative liberatory futures. And I mean, I would have spoken to you a little bit about like the gender thing, especially with regards to the African continent, but I've run out of time. But it is by engaging in difficult conversations around accountability, power sharing, and imagining new ways of thinking about distributing responsibilities that feminist alternatives emerge, and these require difficult questions to be created. So we have to disrupt the cycle of violence at every opportunity, being mindful, that the collective is no longer a single unit with the same experience, beliefs, and needs, but a complex, varied whole. So such a lens is critical when thinking of collective justice and healing needs, and of which mobility justice is one. So I'll stop there for now. I know that I've eaten a little bit into, oh my God, a whole 3 minutes. So I leave this to the team to see what they'll edit out. Thank you.
Okay, follow that. I mean, very powerful, very, very powerful presentation. There were a couple of phrases that jumped out. Whose globalization is it anyway? And also a model, an African model of hosting, which I thought was interesting. We've got about 10 minutes if you guys want to pick up on any of those points, and then we'll go to questions if that's okay. I'm actually really interested to hear a little bit more about Artists at Risk, because at the moment we are partnering with Artists at Risk, and we're hosting a Ukrainian artist. But I would quite like to know about the global reach of Artists at Risk as well, especially in the context that we've just had.
Of course, thank you. I think I speak for everyone when I say that Ukhona raised some incredibly valuable points. A lot of alternatives, which this is exactly, it matches, it aligns very beautifully, I think, with the theme of the conference, and also, you know, this moment that we find ourselves in, this moment of reflection, but also how do we want to redefine, or just how do we want to reimagine the way in which we look at our work in the next few years. I think some of the terms that also jumped out for me was something that she mentioned, ethics of collective care, I believe. So perhaps that's something that I'd like to use as a quick segue into the kind of work that we do, and what we really see with, if you will, a niche a niche of artists and artist residencies that we end up actually engaging with. So firstly, I feel like I'm obligated here to make a little bit of an announcement. As is the case with the English language, a lot of words, there are only so many words. So the reason I mention that is because, unfortunately, there are two programs. There is the Artists at Risk program, which many of you may have heard of already. This is a network of residencies. And again, exactly, I know that Acme also works very closely with Artists at Risk, and there is a specific artist from there, one of their residencies also. The reason why I wanted to make sure that I was managing expectations is that I work with Pan America's Artists at Risk connection. I know. So this is a separate program, again, very similar, I would say, in ethos, as is the case with all of us here, but just wanted to be mindful of setting that expectation as well. But please do look at, the amazing work that Artists at Risk does. Also, please look at the amazing work that we do at Artists at Risk Connection. So again, very briefly, as I said, ethics of collective care, and why that resonates, I feel, with the work that we do. So one of the things that we see with Artists at Risk Connection, or ARC, is that we primarily engage with issues of artistic freedom and censorship. We essentially are a program that is built around this idea of supporting artists whose livelihood, whose way of living are threatened essentially by various forms of persecution, whether that's from state actors or non-state actors. So what that also invariably means is that our experience with relocation and residencies is primarily with artists who find themselves being forcibly displaced. Now, whether that is something that is a result of direct forces or whether that is something a little bit more indirect in the sense that, you know, this is an artist who has chosen to self-exile, we all know that within the language in itself, you know, there are the inherent challenges when we describe these situations. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons why this is important for us is as much as it is important for us to understand and connect the dots, if you will, between artists who have challenges with mobility. And of course, I'm sure my colleagues here will, you know, be able to throw more light on that. As much as that is an important component of this, ethics of collective care really kicks in for us because we're just as concerned with what happens to the artists after they have been displaced, which I think is one of the primary responsibilities that we need to really start engaging with, whether we're looking at residency programs or we're building relocation mechanisms into those residency programs as well. What we often see happening is that while we are able, with great difficulty, nevertheless, I'm not at all, you know, I'm definitely not at all oversimplifying the work that we all do here. It is incredibly difficult for us to connect resources to artists. It is even more difficult when we start thinking about things like immigration, when we think about cultural differences, language, the lack of paperwork. The recent crises that we've seen across the world, whether this is Ukraine, Afghanistan, Myanmar, unfortunately, these are the ones that are that we know of today. There's so much that happens subterranean. There's so much that happens subliminally. There's so much that's ongoing. And while we try and manage all these challenges and we're able to connect an artist to a residency program, therein, you know, the second part of the work begins, which is how do we support this artist in this residency program? How do we make our residency programs bridges, if you will, between those who now must acclimatize themselves in a completely different community, in a different culture, different language. And a few things that I'd like to point out, maybe because I'm very mindful of time as well. I want to make sure that all of us have a chance and that all of you have a chance as well to speak with us. A few things that we've been noticing. We've been conducting a few different projects. Some of them have taken the form of reports. More recently, we've published a report known as Art is Power. It focuses on the lived experience of 20 artists. And it really comes from the idea that one of the main things that we need to do to correct these systemic imbalances is to just talk about the different challenges, because at the end of the day, there's still not enough awareness of the challenges that artists are actually experiencing. So again, one of the few, a few different things that we've understood from different projects, including looking at things, Hong Kong artists from the diaspora, again, artists from Cuba. So really, this is more of a generalization, is that there are two primary issues. One is that artists feel very disconnected to their communities, to the new communities. And again, the communities that they come from, they're in that liminal space where they don't know exactly where they identify, who they identify with anymore. And there's a deep tragedy, a deep tragic feeling that they all endure, something that I feel, we definitely need to consider while we are shaping programs, whether that's psychosocial support or socioeconomic support. And then perhaps the second thing, which directly feeds into the work that, amazing networks like Acme are actually in charge of, which is livelihood as well at the end of it all. So it is also the unfortunate reality that many artists who find themselves displaced are no longer connected to the networks that they have that they have built themselves in. They're no longer connected to the artwork that they do. For instance, I do remember that from a conversation of a Taiwanese artist who, recently relocated originally from Hong Kong and now to Taiwan. And this artist was raising a number of different issues, including the fact that there are, of course, cultural challenges, to acclimatizing to a new environment. They've left their home, they've left their history behind. And I think what's especially palpable from their confusion also is the fact that they don't necessarily know what they want to create art for anymore, because so much of it has been about one particular form of protest and expression. And now they sort of struggle between those balances. Do I still create protest art because that is what is expected of me? Do I no longer have the ability to express the entire spectrum of feelings that I have? And related to that, if I don't feed into these expectations, then how do I find myself a part of the community and a part of the art market in a way that is sustainable for me? So again, perhaps I've left more questions than answers. I don't know. Thank God we have a few days to unpack all these things. But yes, again, being mindful, perhaps I can pass it on to the next unsuspecting victim on this panel.
Do you feel like speaking?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
I mean, it's in this scale. So I appreciate a lot what you shared. I feel is a very, very small gesture what the organization does that we are co-organizing. Which is, it does not, in its offering, it does not reach the global majority. It does not reach enough people who are really in need of space and safety. So I'm not so sure that I can speak to this topic so much. We try, that's so the model of the open residency, which tries to work with as little external funding, has, of course, brings some benefits and some freedom and so on. But again, it only reaches a few. And we have tried with what we can be collaborating with artists at risk, for example, private initiatives, how we can, collect money even from neighbors, donations, and forward it to refugees when the war happened, and also trying to, reach it beyond the Ukrainian refugees, because there was a lot of support for Ukraine, which is great, not enough still, but there were a lot of Russian artists, who were very much at threat. And yes, and I observe exactly these problems. So art becomes second place, right? If it's your survival and so on. So I feel like I cannot talk very much to these topics, unfortunately. Maybe.
I know, I think you said something about that.
What can I add on this? Because we collaborate with as On the Move, being a network, also just like Res Artis, so having many members and many members that are committed to support artists relocating and support with space, money to be able to work and continue to have an artistic practice, but also supporting in so many other areas of daily life and administrative steps and etc. It feels like, and we love Ukhona for throwing bombs and love in a lovely way, in so relevant way, when talking about what we call enforced mobility, but also for pointing out the many structural gaps that we observe. Mind the Gap is the name of the conference. We need to use the plural. There are many gaps, and especially when we talk about the mobility of artists and cultural workers. It feels always that we go towards the same themes, and when talking about mobility, we always go back to the visa issue, the fleeing artist issue, the censorship and freedom of artistic expression issue, etc. But we do it knowing that we would like to, have this be behind us, and these topics and these problems are still very, very present in the daily life of many artists. In terms of mobility gaps, if I continue and elaborate a bit further on what are the gaps that we observe beyond the mobility. I mean, the visas, which is a massive issue in many parts of the world, and the powerful passport that you hold is really defining, in a way, the professional trajectory you can have. We observe also many more recent gaps, or gaps that are being addressed more systematically now in relation to artistic mobility, working conditions of artists, expectations of, you know, what would be artistic work, well-being of artists and cultural professionals, minimum standards in terms of working conditions that are being addressed, you know, at a higher level now, at least in Europe, where, you know, there is a political will to establish these minimum standards. What we see as a gap, you know, one of these gaps that are 20-year-old, is that the funding to support mobility is still missing in so many parts of the world. When we publish every year our yearbook, studying 700 plus open calls that we circulate, we observe that the majority of these open calls to welcome artists or to support artists, not only to do artistic work, but also to participate in festivals, exhibitions, attend workshops, seminars, conferences, etc. The majority of this funding is available only in Europe. And that these create another set of disbalances in terms of accessibility to opportunities, all sorts of opportunities. But what we've been observing also for the last 20 years is that the access to information is still really high, you know, in the pile of gaps. Depending on where you are, you will not access the same kind of information. So you will not be equipped to be able to access all sorts of opportunities. And it's a pity that after 20 years of circulating repeatedly a lot of information, we still struggle with this, you know, particular gap of who gets to access the information. And this topic evolved over time. I mean, many years ago, the access to information was really about, where do I find an opportunity? Where do I find an open call to go to a residency in Argentina? Where do I find, you know, an open call from a foundation that would support any cross-border collaboration? Today is more, we have so much information that people need guidance to navigate this information. So if you are looking at applying for whatever visa, you have an enormous amount of information online, but you need to have human beings being able to walk you through these amount of information. So in that sense, some of the gaps are remaining but changing in the way they are shaped. And then it feels also positive, because let's feel positive that we are, as a community, and everybody in the room also is able to better be vigilant at all these imbalances, gaps, problems that are sometimes quite, you know, structured, embedded in our societies, in terms of gender equality, in terms of representation and diversity, etc. So all of us, I believe, work really hard also to address these issues and act upon them.
I just wanted to respond to that specific point, these specific points that you were making. I think it's also around, like, from this perspective of this space, I think we're working with different people work with different models. So I guess not having access to funding, or not deciding not to apply to certain funds because they impose a lot of restrictions. So first of all, this space being set and trying to work more with, like, mutual aid models, or like a general term of calling this, and trying to work with, like, forms of organizing that are more spread, means that yes, there will be less capacity to offer this kind of support, for sure. But also, I think I wanted to maybe reflect on what you were saying and what Ukhona was saying, that when there is this funding in place, it's very clear, even from our recent application. First of all, Fortress Europe keeps the funding in Europe. That's definitely, and not only that, but it's very specific to different localities, and those localities are also very well off anyway. Like the Nordic European area is very rich in funding opportunities for, and Culture Moves Europe also really has a whole agenda, and it's all historical, and it's all promoting this kind of idea of Europe. And within that, there's no space made for those institutions who receive that funding to, unless there is a very specific political and organizing point of saying, we need to allocate funds, we need to allocate people, we need to allocate like resources to deal with specifically the things that Ukhona was mentioning around, like applying for the visa is not just the visa costs, and even that we have no idea where this money is going at all. There's zero accountability. But there is also a lot of other labor that's involved in making a visa application. And it's expected for the applicant to make that visa application by themselves. So like, as you said, there's a lot of information, but there's nothing built in the structure of how somebody is expected to do that labor on top of the labor of applying for like the residency, living their life, doing their art, doing all of this. So yeah, I think when we started trying to respond in this very like direct, as I said, as Sepi said, very minimal way, it was about, there is a space around the war in Ukraine. It was very specific to, there is this space, we have actual material space where we could host people, but we don't have anything else. And that became very obvious how that, like, not having any other access to resources was not allowing to put in place any of these things that then were very clear that were happening to people who were displaced and came over, because support also needs to be built in as a longer term, like you were saying. It's not just a response to a crisis.
Yeah, and I guess in this situation, networks helped, right? Networking with artists at risk, for example, networking with, artists' resources on networks. We know a lot of people in many different places, and we would, mobilize whatever would be possible there. And then privately, because it's an artist-run space, we jump in, of course, if there is need for something. So. But as informal as this, and then it also was a bit of a problem for us to access some of the resources because of bureaucracy. So, when you are in an informal institution and there are bureaucratic barriers to be able to offer the resource to some people, and it might be standing empty and not be able to, distribute because of bureaucracy. That was painful, yeah. That sound meant, is a marker for time? Sorry.
I don't know. Do you think it's quite a good time to possibly go to different questions? I know we have two roving mics.
We were a little bit confused.
Yeah, we didn't really have a chance to introduce MASSIA really in what it does. There was, or we missed that opportunity. If that's interesting to people.
Actually, yeah. I mean, while the mic's roam around, maybe if the both of you can speak to that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Do it.
We just have some prompts because it's easier for us to talk to. So sorry for the screen. Okay, so I start.
Yeah. So we maybe try. Sorry, the preparation for this moment was a bit chaotic. Do you want to take the ball rolling or follow up?
Yeah. So already, as we said, we wanted to share a bit about the space, which is a collectively run by art and culture practitioners themselves, and is self-organized and functions on this like open residency model. So there are no applications, there's no evaluation of people's work. It is mostly self-funding to attend. It doesn't require a disciplinary connection, so everybody is welcome. It doesn't exclude presence by discipline or the type of practice. And I guess we were thinking about this panel, and like the title also of the panel, which was Artist Mobility in Age of Instability. So answering the cultural artist mobility question, the main issue for MASSIA and the way we were reflecting on it was that instability is not a new condition. It's just we're talking about it more in this context of the pandemic and the European context as well, but it is a condition revolving around the production of scarcity and the distribution of resources. And the biggest global issue that impacts MASSIA's work is this colonial, extractivist, neoliberal, and militarized world which manufactures scarcity, and that renders those lucky who are able to find ways to share their lifetime and energy time for survival with vast differences concerning the chances of this survival and the quality of life. So the fact that another challenge that we're thinking about in like a global scale that affects also MASSIA is that the capacity for collectively mobilizing and distributing resources and practicing solidarity and transcending established communities, of course, with the limitations and the ways in which those who are rich by this solidarity is also unequally distributed, and also to investigate, question, and reflect on the intentions behind said solidarity, who it comes from and where it is directed towards, to shift from, or to try to at least be reflective of positionality and like potential saviorist moments. So we have a few points, but I don't know how much time there is. And okay, yeah, is that okay?
No.
So we're talking about this like economic model of participation, or trying to play with the idea of what participation can actually do when it's taken as a model of running a space. So the question behind that is, how can we organize alternative to transactional models, and how could we put resources in common, especially in this realm of cultural production. A form of distributing labor that relies less on external funding and somehow enables relative freedom from these global agendas of big cultural institutions, and forwards some freedoms to those who take part in terms of access to the space and lifting production pressures. So these terms that have been also mentioned of collaboration, co-creation, sharing versus owning are also terms that we reflect on and throw around and question and throw away and come back to.
Yeah, maybe in connection to, you know, the phrasing that you used, building alternative worlds, right? So we do that within a very small model, right? It doesn't reach very far, but there we prefigure, we rehearse a certain logic, right? A different kind of relating, where from transactional, economically transactional, you go to participation. What can you do with participation? If you organize together, you mobilize the resources that are available and you put it in common for, you know, a wider community to use. It's not like, here, this is the collective, this is the residency, these are the organizers. It's a resource. It is being maintained by an amorphous group of people, whoever docks onto that idea and resonates with it and makes it available for a wide group of people.
Yeah, so it also has limitations,
of course,
in terms of the uneven distribution of work around care, admin, maintenance.
Of course.
Dependent on individual resources, structural positioning, access, and also the larger sense of using any kind of economics model as a form of organizing relationality and questioning that, because we're still functioning somehow within that. In terms of understanding our relations to each other, the work that we're doing, the disparities. But I guess the questions are more around affirmative in the way of like trying to figure out together and to understand what does it take to create conditions for ourselves that we would like to see existing.
Exactly, and this feeds into the way it is financed, as we say, the way it is administered, the way it communicates, the way it makes, if we have funding, the way we communicate that. Do we put emphasis on merit? You know, is it about professionalization, or is it about people needing space, needing access to certain resources? And then there's also this, like, it's very easily accessible for those who can afford. And again, that's kind of, it's not really accessible fully. There are other accessibility issues. It's for people who have mobility issues. It's not accessible. Racialized people, for them, it will not feel safe, very safe, you know, in the Estonian countryside. There are many issues like this. But you know, there's this space that sits there and makes it relatively easy to go there. There's space away from everyday life. You can work or be, you know, not work. If your work looks like not working. There's a forum, you know, these spaces that offer forums for discourse, for meeting, for experimenting, because you don't have to produce something. You did not need to program your time there. You did not come up with a project application, blah, blah, blah. You know, this kind of lightness, ease, and freedom that these spaces can bring.
Yeah, I guess that's a larger a response and a situatedness around like gig economy, productivity schemas, production, process oriented versus production oriented. What would it mean if we take that as the starting point? So those are some of the kind of ideas in which this space, and it has historically kind of like existed. It's been set up in 2017. So
as a partner of Performing Art Forum and PAF, so we build on the experience of which exists for 20 years almost. You know, we build up on that experience.
Yeah,
cool. Thanks for giving us that time too.
Not at all. Okay, I think we now will have a little Q&A. If people have any questions, raise your hand, and we have a couple of roving mics in the audience. And I also think we're just monitoring to see whether there are any questions that have come through. I think James there, halfway down.
I think also up top as well, maybe. I remember seeing a hand closer to where the camera is actually. Yeah, there we go. That there as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Brebenel Elikemfiachi, artist and a director of Pervocrace International Artist Residency in Ghana. I think I am very curious and interested in the entire conference, but this very opening is quite very intriguing. I would say anytime the issue of mobility and inclusivity appears, pops up again the issue of funding, information, and also visa issues. Coming from Ghana and living in Ghana, I am a lived experience to all these very details. And I have been traveling across the world for almost 7 years now, but I'm still wondering what has changed ever in these 7 years for me myself. I have only become very privileged in the sense that I am used to the discrimination and I'm used to the struggle, and I know how I have learned how to manage it, but it doesn't mean the condition has changed. I have just learned to manage it. So I always think about my other selves. How are they going to begin? Because I began from somewhere, and I might be thinking because of my privilege, the situation has changed, but it's just because now I know how to manage the situation. One of my questions is that what works are we doing as cultural institutions and artist residencies that are critically thinking about inclusivity, thinking about mobility, thinking about structural discrimination? What works are we doing towards that when we are also much aware that many of the embassies across the globe, they have cultural and art departments? What is our connection to those embassies' cultural departments? What are the responsibility of those cultural departments? If we have right now, I heard about the artists at risk. I know also a few things about that. And there is currently an artist who is a trans woman applying for one of the programs in Berlin, which is under Artists at Risk in collaboration with another organization. And for this person to get the 18-month residency, have to declare to the embassy that she is not going to stay in Germany after the 18 months. And she has to also declare that she is not at risk and not in danger to seek for asylum after 18 months. And I asked myself, but this person is going and the artist at risk. What does that even mean to the embassy, that going for a program under artists at risk? But you have to declare you are not at risk just because that's the only way you can get a visa, that you are not going to stay in Germany. So we are thinking about all this cultural inclusivity, thinking about safe space, thinking about care, but at the same time, we are actually tightening the borders and tightening the immigration laws, and paranoid about people migrating to Europe. So I'm just curious to know, what are we doing? Like, because myself, I'm a residency director, so I'm inclusive, but what are we doing together with the embassies, which they claim that they have cultural and art department? What are their positions and collaboration and relationship to artist institutions across the world? Thank you.
Maybe I can attempt to respond to what is a very important question, and one that I'm not sure we'll be able to perfectly answer at the moment. I think, and I think this is something that I definitely wanted to, I actually thank all of you here for almost reminding me to maintain a positive, optimistic perspective, as I am actually an optimist. It's kind of ironic that I tend to think of the challenges first, but I'm actually a very optimistic person. That is a side note that nobody needed to know. But coming back, of course, to your, to your point, I think that this is that I hear your frustration and I feel it as well. I think also, as somebody who, also has to jump through a lot of hoops, if you will, to be able to travel, I think it goes back to some very powerful things that we were talking about, the dynamics, if you will, between, the passports, which is a more powerful passport, et cetera, and so forth. My sense is, and I can again speak to some of the work that we're doing at ARC, at Artists at Risk Connection. So again, the Artists at Risk program that you're talking about is AR and really more of a residency program. One of the things that we also, a big component of the work that we do at Artists at Risk Connection, which I'm sure is shared by many of us here, is advocacy as well. And one of the big pillars of our advocacy very much hinges on I'm going to say that it exclusively speaks to cultural mobility, although it very much is a part of that, in the sense of, what can we do in terms of revisiting and re-examining immigration policies between different countries? How can we re-examine the relationship, like you rightly mentioned, between cultural workers, and again, larger state agendas. Something that maybe we can actually start using as a foundation to reimagine things. Again, I would sort of say twofold is one, I think definitely reimagining our need to even to travel in the first place for assistance. So let me contextualize that further. I think this is, it speaks to something that Yohann had actually mentioned, actually even the project that you're graciously running as well, which is there's so much value in a lot of grassroots regional projects. And I think what tends to happen is that there's not a lot of emphasis or visibility of those regional mechanisms or those regional projects. So as a result, for instance, and this is something that we've really been trying to reimagine with our partners like the Mekong Cultural Hub, for instance, Forum Asia, organizations in Asia, of course, again, counterparts elsewhere, which is, do we need to be sending or encouraging all our artists to be going to Europe? Are there other alternatives? Should that be something that we explore with the existing immigration conundrum, if you will, which is one way of sort of, I think, addressing the challenge of do we want to re-examine where we locate our residency programs and our relocation mechanisms? Basically meaning, do we want to start really thinking about more regional residencies and regional residency programs and regional relocation mechanisms? I think the other interesting thing, in addition to to maybe lobbying, etc., for softer immigration, rules, etc., really hinges also on. Actually, I'm so sorry. I think I've just, I've actually lost my thought over there. Yes, it'll come back to me. Yes, there's a lot to process over here. It's a very big question, what you mentioned. So yes, Yohann, please, save me.
I can pick up, no, not saving, but pick up on one thing that you were mentioning in terms of intra-regional mobility. We, very recently, last May, we organized a cultural mobility forum in Tunisia, Tunis, where Ukhona was actually invited and gave a fantastic presentation too. We were reminded, organizing this event in Northern Africa, how complicated artistic mobility is also in other contexts. Because we are based in Europe, many of us, we always complain about Fortress Europe. And it was a big reminder that intra-regional, intra-African mobility is very complicated. Mobility within Asia is very complicated, etc. And we could hear some of the mobility funders, private foundations or initiatives, trying to focus more and more on these dimensions. So making sure that an Egyptian art maker could actually go to Lebanon and back to their country, but also maybe go to Algeria, which is not that easy, etc. So also to try to unpack to unpack this conversation at a more regional level, if that makes sense. And also during these days, but in many conversations, we observe that the role of the official governmental cultural institutes are questioned. Let's put it this way, question in terms of what are the agenda they have, but also very basically the mandate they have or the means they have. And certainly they are not always the main actors or the main supporters for international mobility and cross-border collaboration, because this is not always their mandate. And in terms of supporting artists or professionals that are at risk, this is really not their job, I would say. So it's also interesting how they sometimes pick up on these tasks to help, but are not, this is not their job. And we have very recent examples from foreign institutes or governmental institutes that actually help identify and route some artists and cultural workers at risk. These past days, from Yemen, from Somalia, etc., to try to help the authorities to actually, channel people at risk and help and support their extraction. So it's always difficult when we talk about mobility, first to focus on Europe only, because Europe is one big group of countries. Many of these limitations, I would say even sometimes humiliations, are dealt at national level and not at European level, and especially in these cases of relocation, extremely complicated visa processes, etc. And sometimes we forget that in many other areas of the world, the mobility is also as complex, even if not more complex. Yeah, maybe this is...
This is actually very helpful. Thank you. This inadvertently did clarify what I was trying to remember and say. I think also in terms of, maybe very much riffing off of what Yohann said about, really, if something is part of a government or bureaucratic official's mandate or not, I think that's something where we may also, I know it might sound frustrating for me to say this, but we may need to be more creative, a bit more creative on how we articulate our ask when it comes to mobility as well. So what I actually was trying to say earlier is lately, I think this is more of a recent trend, but something that we've also been noticing is how a lot of organizations have started expanding on how they want to talk about mobility without actually saying mobility in itself. So for instance, it's tapping into resources that are dedicated to, say, emergency or resilience grants funds, and then using that as a method to, to go ahead and address the mobility concerns as well. Another really interesting development that we've been picking up on is, for instance, I believe the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, Alexandra Zantaki, she's really been working, I believe the ethos of her mandate has really been looking at the relationship between cultural actors and sustainable development. And the development agenda. Now, is there a way in which we can, instead of maybe just honing in on the mobility question, locate the mobility question into the larger narrative of cultural actors' participation in cultural life and how that attaches itself to the development agenda? I'm not saying that that's the way forward, but that gives us an additional opportunity, an additional door to open and say, look, that's great. This is our rationale. And this is why the work that we're doing on mobility matters. And this is why you should be helping us. So I think, especially in this day and age, there are opportunities, yes, but I definitely think that we have the additional responsibility, if you will, of also trying to be creative and seeing how else we can fit, our questions and maybe re-articulate them in narratives that already exist.
I think we can get another couple of questions in. I know there were hands up.
Hi, I'm Lisa Funderburg Hoffman. I'm the president and CEO of Artist Communities Alliance. I want to thank you for that question, and I want to thank you all for your response on that. And I just wanted to add a plus. Typically, when we're in these forums as residency implementers, as leaders of networks, we are very much intellectualizing a problem that we don't have the first person experience of the person who is going through either a racialized experience, experience hate and being otherized at the center of that conversation. So hearing from you put this into a real case study and a point of issue that I think really needs to be uplifted and to be held throughout this conference, especially as we're talking about equity. And we say inclusion, but what we're really speaking about is exclusion, right? We're talking about exclusion, and how do we address that? One of the things I'd like to offer up is that as we consider going forward, one, our engagement process, ensuring that we have that specificity of the issue, because when you are Black or reside in a Black body and you're moving anywhere in this world, you are persecuted. We know this is true for trans bodies. We know this is true for disabled bodies. And I would like to see a little bit more of specificity to that. And I think each of our platforms have an opportunity to uplift that. Secondly, the training for hosts, how to be advocates at the local level to encourage mobility is something else that we need to center. At ACA, we often talk about the conditions to support artists and cultural workers. This is part of the work of the artist residency, and we have to be mindful. I think you spoke to earlier about the savior complex, but also adding additional labor to the artists when they're coming to figure out these problems and to negotiate. And then lastly, this idea of what can we do as a unified platform to say, this is where this ends and this is where this begins. I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be in the company of everyone, but I do have to underscore that when we are talking about those who have been historically marginalized and the stories of those who have left on the fringes, they have to be at the center of that conversation because we don't really have we are operating under a different sense of immediacy. A different sense of immediacy and urgency. And I think the call for each of us is to think about that. How do we address that immediacy with some practical solutions? How do we activate the funding to get there? And I'm really looking forward to these small conversations in that way to get us there. But also immediately have a note that if we're not getting the resources of what we know into the hands of residency operators, into the hands of artists, then we're going to do something different immediately to address that. Artists at Risk, you all are doing fantastic work, and that should always be uplifted. And just saying thank you for the deep thinking around that and the continuous inquiry. But we do have to do something about this because it is getting more contentious and more of our bodies are existing in contested spaces. And unfortunately, there are some of us that can't pass. We can't slip through the gates. I just wanted to say that. I wanted to say thank you. I appreciate y'all.
Thank you for sharing what you shared.
I'm just conscious to see whether there might be any questions that have come in online from our digital James. The mic's just coming, James.
Hi, just got one Q&A. I'm going to paraphrase it. When it comes to artist residency visas, how do we identify a type of visa required? What does professional development falls under? Thank you.
So it depends a lot on the country. I'm not going to delve into the visa issues and unfold all the different according to the countries. I would say this though, we have on the move a lot of members that are mobility info points, just like the Art Info Point UK here. So mobility info points are portals or agencies, initiatives that are welcoming all sorts of questions about visa issues, tax issues, administrative process issues, CONNET issues, etc. So they are specialized. We have them not in all countries, as you can imagine, but we are developing projects at the moment to support organization to become mobility info points, with the idea of trying to provide as much as possible these very technical and pragmatic information to artists and cultural professionals. I think international development, I'm jumping on all the keywords and of course we'll leave you time to elaborate and your own answers or comments. International development really for me refers to, in the context of residency, to the roles of leaders and coordinators of residency program, just as we urge. So what are the roles in terms of accompanying, the guests of these programs, and how much you invest or you are able to invest your own knowledge in terms of support, solidarity, tips and advice that you can provide. And for the last bit, which was funding, funding at On the Move, we published mobility funding guides. So basically, if you're looking for funding on the music field in Europe, you have 300+ pages of grants available. So I would really encourage all the people looking for money to navigate these PDF files. We try to update them as much as possible. And to add this, I coordinated the one on the Balkan region, also the one on the South Mediterranean region. We always assume that in many areas of the world, there are not much funding. And in the end, when you actually have all the expertise around you and you delve into this issue of funding, you realize that there are way more than what we would assume at the beginning of the process. Hence this guide being very helpful.
So at a university, is there any way that the higher education sector, university sector, can support residencies, support artists, support collectives to kind of, navigate through some of these issues? So it's just a general question. So.
I don't think we can speak to that point, but it's a very, I took a note. Thank you for your comment, because there are, it's interesting to live in a very small country like Estonia, where, a lot of people know each other. And since the war started, we built this network with all the creative residencies in Estonia, and to do exactly this advocacy work, go to the embassies, go as this bigger organization, right? Use our scale, and see how we can support these processes, which is always difficult, especially as a self-organized space. We're already so low on resources. It's a challenge, but it's an important one.
Hello, my name is Yohann from Miha from Helsinki. I just wanted to sort of share a little experience related to the terminology and related to the expectations of artists at risk residencies. So we are a group of organizations. We started this Ukraine program, the Ukraine emergency residencies last year. It was 1 week after the attack. But then what we did then a month later or a few weeks later was that we changed the name to Ukraine Solidarity Residencies. And that was such a change, because then, because we had this word emergency, lingering, it's sort of the same as risk. If that is the key word, it's sort of who needs to be at risk, and then sort of risk becomes sort of this embedded thing that it always is there. So this keyword solidarity, I think that was, that worked much better. And I think it sort of framed what we can do better, as art organizations. It's limited what we can do to emergencies, with solidarity. That's something we can do. And maybe as a last comment in terms of the expectations and then the relationship, I think for us the factor from the beginning, it was a network, and it's still a network, and we meet every week on Thursday to touch base, and then the artists also know that we are a network. So kind of the expectations of what can happen and how things can evolve, it becomes sort of more embedded and more richer, and there's less of pressure on this artist and just one organization interface. That's it.
Artports. I'm Vardit from Artports in Tel Aviv in Israel. Actually, we currently have an artist from Artists at Risk network at us. But I was thinking, as we were going from Europe into smaller regions, it's also important to remember that in many states, mainly countries in conflict, the question of mobility is inside the country itself. And therefore, I think that's also the first thing you can do, is try and find ways inside the country itself to find people who needs the help for mobility. And the one thing we realized mainly with Palestinian artists, that you need to really give not only the support, as most ones are with housing, but also understand the cultural gaps, as can women travel alone? Can this residency actually be relevant for them in this way? All kind of things that might not be relevant for other residencies are relevant over there. And I think even in the basic periphery center or as I said, transgender, cisgender, it's a thing that is the first mobility actions that can be done. And I think there are many other states in conflicts over here, but even non-in-states conflicts.
Maybe we've got time for just one more in the middle of the room there.
Hi, hi there. Thank you. And thank you, panel. Great to be here today. My name is Clemeni Christopher. I'm a director of D6 Culture in Transit based in both the UK and Cyprus. Been very interested around this conversation of working with artists at risk, but also this question of the collective care that we need to have, the ethics of collective care. And coming back, James, to the point you just made there about education. So I imagine all of us here believe in the value of art to society, I would hope. I imagine that all of us believe in the value of cultural rights and the work that the Special Rapporteur is doing. How do we, though, when that responsibility is quite huge as cultural organizations? This morning I'm dealing with a Syrian artist he's losing his home. He's worked with us for a little while. He's come through a displacement scheme. His physical ability is less than others, and it's hugely problematic. So all of my friends in our region are suddenly rushing in to try to see how we can house somebody. So the really practical issues of care are there. How does the education system address the reality then of equity of practice when actually not all artists have equal access and there isn't equity there? And as organizations, we fundraise for art, but how do we also understand the importance of care in that conversation?
I think that's a really good place to leave this morning's discussions, because after a break, I think we'll be touching on some of these issues again. So thank you all for coming up with a few technical issues to start off with, but that really, I think the end of that was really very rewarding. Thank you to the panel. Please give them a round of applause. And there is now a break. There is a break of half an hour, but just to warn you that members of staff will be starting to round you up with 5 minutes to go so that we can fill the auditorium, so we can start promptly in half an hour's time. Thank you so much.